Well, on behalf of the Oceans Caucus Foundation, I want to thank each and every one of you for taking time out of your day to hear this very important briefing. It's clear from the turnout that this is an issue that doesn't just impact Gulf states, but it affects a lot of economies across the nation. So I think we're all very lucky to have such a wonderful panel of speakers today. I know when I was asked to act as a guest moderator for today's session, I jumped at the opportunity, in part because each of these experts is well known on their own, but collectively, as an entity, it's quite an honor to hear them speak today. So the concept of Rigs-to-Reefs may be new for some of you, for others maybe it's a bit old, but really it's not a new concept. This is something that has been discussed and deliberated for over a decade, even longer. But the fact that we are all here today with these variety of speakers, with the perspectives that they bring from different industries, from different stakeholders, really shows that people still have some questions. Hopefully you brought your questions with you today, because the policies and the science can be at times complex. But that's why we have experts and that's why we have science. You here in the room know that environmental and economic policy is about trade-offs. It's about costs and benefits, with the goal of minimizing footprint while maximizing positive impact. Impact to economy, impact to societies, impact for our entire nation. So calculating the value of a given approach and the numerous trade-offs goes part and parcel with the topic we're discussing today. This concept of partial rig removal and allowance of artificial reefs has attracted supporters from all sides, showing that there is some salience, there is science behind it, and even state and federal governments, many businesses, nonprofits, and civil society have stood behind it. And we'll hear some of their perspectives today. And hopefully, if you have questions that are burning in your mind, these are the guys to answer it. So I hope you brought those questions. And clearly, with some of the most complex rigs extending from what I hear as far as 1,000 feet deep in the ocean, it's clear that there's a depth of issues to discuss here, and I hope that they can shine some light on that. So without further ado, I'm going to mention our speakers here. Collectively, we have Larry McKinney, a PhD and Executive Director from the Harte Research Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies. We have Michael Nussman, who's President and CEO of American Sportfishing Association. And we have Jack Sterne, who's the Director of Strategic Initiatives for Oceans at EDF. We're going to start off today's session with Larry McKinney. So Dr. McKinney, if you would. Just a bit about Dr. McKinney while he's standing here next to me. He's really focused on the science of Gulf issues, environmental issues and economic issues, bringing in a multi-stakeholder perspective, a policy perspective, and he has a long history of really leading the charge in that field. So we're very pleased to have Dr. McKinney.
Don't run off with my blue folder. That was mine. That's okay. Well, thank you all very much. I appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate that everyone is here with us today. The numbers of interest in this topic. I just want to explain this slide here. This is this introductory slide. This is a platform that's adjacent to the Flower Gardens National Marine Sanctuary. I'm at about 100 feet looking toward the surface, and you can see the surface. Then there's about 300 feet of water behind my back going down. So that's the size and scope of these platforms. I do want to thank the caucus for hosting this and putting this together. I greatly appreciate that, the opportunity to come and visit with you. And I also want to recognize and thank Representative Farenthold and his staff for allowing me to, or inviting me to help participate in this, and also for their leadership in this issue. It's a very important one for us in the coastal bend of Texas and around the Gulf of Mexico, and the opportunity to bring this to you is really important. So if you hit that next slide, we'll jump right into it. This is a compilation slide from my last dive in October on that rig that's adjacent to the Flower Garden, just to give you an idea of the diversity. At that time, we ran across a whale shark, which is in the lower corner, which was about 10 foot longer than the width of this room, hanging off these platforms, and they do this quite frequently. But I wanted to answer two questions. The questions that come up from a science perspective: are these platforms and artificial reefs, are they productive? Do they produce anything? And are they just basically nuisances, attractive nuisances that collect fish like a magnet, make them easier to harvest for both commercial and recreational purposes? And so that's the questions I want to answer. If you hit the next one. The first point is, the question is, and the answer is yes, they are productive. They do concentrate energy. They bring in sunlight and collect nutrients. They take those They magnify and turn that into biomass. That biomass in turn is transported out to the ecosystem of which they are a part in the farms of fish and other things that benefit that ecosystem. So the answer to that question, and there's been enough scientific studies in the literature now to really make that point. They do produce. They are a productive part of the ecosystem of which they are a part. The questions that we deal with now is to what extent are they, and how productive are they, and in what way do they work? Because as we construct these artificial reefs out of these oil and gas platforms, we take these once active platforms and turn them into artificial reefs. It's a pretty expensive proposition no matter the way you do it. So you want to make sure that you're configuring them in the best possible way to produce the most biomass that's possible. The answer to the other question is, do they attract fish? And they do. They do concentrate fish in, and they've done this type of thing. And the question, and the answer, I guess, to the question at that point is, do they do that? Well, yes. Well, so what? Of course they do that. And I've been in the fisheries management business for almost 30 years, either directly or indirectly. And I can tell you that in that time, and these oil and gas platforms have been there since 1942, that in that time, I've never seen a federal regulation or a state regulation that was promulgated because of the attractive situation with these oil and gas rigs and these types of things. It hasn't happened. And the reason, and it could have, I'm sure they do have an effect on that because they do attract fish, do make it easier to catch, but that's when we have fisheries management. And believe me, fisheries management is not rocket science. It's pretty straightforward. We know how to deal with these things with catch limit seasons and all these types of things, and to take into account with it. And the point, of course, is the reason we manage these fisheries these days under Magnuson-Stevens is to exploit those populations for economic benefit. Now, whether you think that's correct or not, that's a whole different philosophical argument, but that's what we do today. And so that's exactly what that does, and we can manage for that if we need to, but so far we haven't needed to. And that's just to make that point of catch and release. We can go on to the next one. So I wanted to show you this a little bit to give you an idea and talk about that a bit. This is just to give you an idea of what productivity on these platforms look like. When these platforms are built in the yard, the builders and the oil and gas companies allow for 4 to 6 inches of fouling. We call it fouling around those structures because they know that biomass will grow. So if you just visually, you can see that there is productivity in that farm there. It does occur. And as they do so, these are all sponges and these types of things. They attract these reef fishes. It gets to a point where you can't tell the difference between them and a natural reef. The one difference is, of course, that these platforms can extend all the way to the surface, where our reefs in the Gulf are typically low-lying, below 50 or 60 feet of water and that type of thing. So they have a vertical profile that you don't normally see. But I think it speaks for itself when it talks about productivity of these structures. And you can see the small fish and so forth that swarm around these types of things. I think we'll go ahead and go to the next one to save some time. Oop. Somewhere there, you can do this corner over here. So I wanted to set the stage for you a little bit and talk about what's happening with these oil and gas platforms that's caused such an issue with the artificial reefing community and the fishery community in general. And I do want to give a special thanks to the National Ocean Council and Darren Badroth, who helped us bring this information together, and it's been widely used throughout the Gulf of Mexico since they've done that. And so I'm going to run through this fairly quickly. I want to get to the last slide. This slide I want to go to, and it gives you the idea of what we're talking about. As we've progressed over time, of course, oil and gas development in the Gulf has moved further and further offshore into deeper and deeper water. When you move into those deeper waters, you no longer use fixed leg platforms. You use floating platforms and those types of things. So the structures that we're interested in for artificial reefs are these fixed leg structures that we can use. And so as we move further off and the oil and gas play out in the nearshore areas, these platforms have to be removed. We do want them removed out of the Gulf if they're not serving a useful purpose like an artificial reef. And as you can see, we're not constructing or putting in anymore. So it's becoming a critical issue, as we'll talk about in a moment, as these platforms disappear because of the economic benefits that they do generate. So we'll just go through the next ones, and I don't want to spend a lot of time. Let's go into the last and just kind of flip through these till you come up till 2007. Right here, move back one if you can. So this gives you an idea of where we are today, and what we're seeing here is the black dots represent existing platforms. The white dots are platforms that were once there but have been removed. And so if you can flip back to the one right before that, then back and forth, you can see what's happened over the last several years, that the rate of removal has greatly accelerated, as primarily directed because of the idle iron policy, which came to the fore right after Katrina and Rita, when a number of these platforms were turned over and lost in that regard, and it really began to have a push to get these things out of the Gulf if they're not being used for some other purposes. That has really accelerated the removal process and created the problem that we have to deal with in artificial reefs. Okay, if you can go to the next. It's a particularly acute problem for Texas because, unlike Louisiana, we don't have as many. There's about 3,000 of these rigs, a little over 2,000 left now. And along the Texas coast, there are fewer than Louisiana, so every rig we lose in Texas means one less place that we have access for fishing. And that's really what has happened over the years, and it was an unintended consequence of the oil and gas development. They didn't really think about that, I'm sure, in the 40s when they began to put these platforms in, but almost immediately they began to grow fouling and biomass, and fish became attracted to them. And so as more and more platforms went in, a whole new industry grew up right along beside it, and that was the recreational fishing industry. And Mike's going to talk about that and the economic impact in a second, so I'm not going to spend any time on it. But basically what we now have is $1 billion offshore fishing industry in the state of Texas, not just the Gulf, just the state of Texas, that's really associated with these types of things. And so the idea, as these platforms are coming out now, what's going to happen to that industry? That's got their attention. It's got the attention of a lot of our small coastal communities and our fishermen in general, of what are they going to do? And that's the importance of these artificial reef programs that take these platforms and transform them into artificial reefs. And they are directly related to this fishery. Red snapper are our most important commercial and recreational fishery in the Gulf, particularly in our western part of the Gulf. Here again are the platforms. If you go to the next slide, the red dots are where red snapper occur, and the black dots are where they have not been found. So clearly, red snapper are closely associated with not only the oil and gas platforms, but of course the hard banks associated with them. So it's very important for us. So just to kind of show you that, just to give you an idea of some of the distribution of these fish. There's red snapper. This is at water depths of about 50 to 60 feet. And you'll see some more in a moment at greater depths, but you can get an idea of the number of fish there. On a typical rig that's well developed, there could be anywhere from 20 to 70,000 red snapper. And that's a significant number, of course, when you have the number of rigs that we do. How many times? Okay. So we can just go ahead and wrap on going through it. So let's skip on through this and go on. We already talked about that and come to this last point. So there's a couple of points that I hope we have time to discuss about. We've talked about there has been the idea of having a moratorium, putting a moratorium in place to stop this rig removal process until we can deal with this issue of the artificial reefs and the economics associated with it. And I think this is an issue that on all sides we would rather not see happen, but recognize the fact that the moratorium acts as a big stick to move us all forward to dealing with the carrots of this issue. Because this is one of these good news type stories. There are benefits to all parties on this thing, oil and gas companies and fishermen as well, as we turn these structures into artificial reefs. There are pluses for everyone here. But basically, I think certainly from the fishery side of the community, that I hear from the fishing side of the agenda, is that we still need that incentive to move us toward that side so we don't lose inertia. So that moratorium, while I don't think anyone likes it as a potential solution, they're keeping it in place. I hope to keep it in place to drive it that way. The other issue that has come up is essential fish habitat, and perhaps designating these platforms in that way. And that is something that, that just recently a panel's met to talk about that with the Gulf Fisheries Council. And their consensus was this is probably not the way to go in this type of thing. In fact, the negative sides of this are probably far outweigh any benefits that could be derived, and we need to look at other ways. Again, we can talk about that in a moment if we need to. But I want to, I think I've hit my time at this point, so that was a very quick summary of issues. You're going to hear more from other speakers, and certainly we'll hopefully have time to talk about these ramifications of all this as we go forward. So again, thank you for your attention.
We're now moving on to hear from Michael Nussman, who's the president and CEO of American Sportfishing Association, so a little bit more perspective on the value of fisheries in that regard. Michael is speaking from a perspective of the fishermen, but also in terms of those issues, how it impacts recreation, how it impacts local tourism, ecotourism and such in the Gulf. So I'd like to welcome up Mr. Michael Nussman.
Thank you. I'll get right into this. My name is Mike Nussman. I'm with the American Sport Fishing Association. First slide, if we could. ASA is a trade association. We do all the things trade associations do. We represent manufacturers, wholesalers, retailers, media in the fishing tackle industry. We started back in 1933, and by my math, that makes us somewhere around 80 years old. We're over in Alexandria. Next slide. I've got a simple task today. I get to talk about fun. And fun is a great thing to talk about. Outdoor recreation, the key reason people go out and play in the outdoors isn't to drive the economy. It's to have fun. And we believe at ASA that what we're doing is enabling all Americans to have fun, and that's a great job to have. If we look at all outdoor recreation, we find 140 million Americans participate in outdoor recreation each year. That's 464 billion in spending, 6.1 million jobs, and quite a bit in federal and state taxes. Next slide. If we look at participation in different activities, and I think I like this slide because we're a little like Avis, we're number 2, so we're trying harder. But as you can see, the first blue bar shows running, jogging, and trail jogging, which says that's the most participated in of all outdoor activities. Next, you see all the different types of fishing. Third, you see all the different types of bike riding. Fourth, all the ways to camp. And fifth, hiking. These are all very, very, very popular activities. One thing I'll say is that for fishing tends to be a gateway activity. Our friends at the Ocean Industry Association tell us that people get introduced to outdoor activities through fishing more so than any other activity. Next slide. All right, now the importance of recreational fishing in the Gulf of Mexico. These are some very broad numbers. Here you see there are about 2.6, 2.7, 2.8 million saltwater anglers. They have about $7 billion in total economic impact, support 66,000 jobs, 537 million in federal tax revenue, and 439 million in state and local tax revenue. Now this is just saltwater fishing. It doesn't include any of the freshwater fishing that takes place in and around the Gulf of Mexico. So if I could, next slide. You've seen this slide before, but what's interesting, this is the oil and gas, natural gas platforms that exist in the Gulf. And you see they tend to be much more in the Western Gulf than in the Eastern Gulf. So if I could, that's an important fact you'll see in a second. Go right ahead to that next slide. One thing about the Gulf of Mexico and many ocean areas is the bottoms are not all coral reefs, as we might imagine, or they're not all hard substrates, or even soft corals, or rocky. Most of them, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico, are silty, sandy, muds, and when you look across them, you see something that looks sort of like this. Next slide. In fact, it's probably hard to see this slide from the back, but if you look, particularly in the Western Gulf, and if you look in the Western Gulf, you'll see most of the areas are devoid of hard substrates. And you're really seeing a sand bottom, a mud bottom, a silt bottom. Now, that's not entirely true. There certainly are areas like Flower Gardens Banks. But They are certainly the exception to the rule, not the rule. So one reason the biology behind these platforms is so important is because there are so few hard structures in the Gulf. Next slide. Larry had far better fish pictures than I did, but when I talk about the reason anglers want to go to these platforms or to these artificial reefs, it's fairly simple. Your average saltwater recreational angler goes fishing 10 times a year. I maintain anything you do only 10 times a year, you're not going to be very good at. So the first thing you need, this is really true for freshwater too, you need an abundance of fish. Without good, healthy fish populations, angling really doesn't occur in any large measure. So we think, and if you've got some way to locate those fish around artificial structures or natural structures, that's where anglers tend to go, because while we don't think they're overly smart, we do think they know when they go and catch fish, they tend to go back to the same place over and over again. So as you can see from both Larry's videos as well as this slide, these areas do hold everything from invertebrates all the way up to whale sharks and everything in between. Next slide. Okay, getting to the very specifics of oil platforms and how they fit into the jobs economic piece. Well, in the Gulf of Mexico, and for that matter off the California coast, ASA has been involved in both the Gulf of Mexico issue and years before that in California on the same types of activities. We find that major hubs of fishing and fish are at these platforms and these artificial reefs that occur after the platforms are taken down. And as Larry suggested, since 2006, the removal of platforms had exceeded the installation. In 2010, 23 platforms were installed, while 161 were removed. Traditionally or historically, we've only been able to turn into artificial reefs, about 10% of the platforms that were removed. Now, when platforms seem to be growing by an ever-increasing number, that wasn't an alarming trend. But as platforms start to come out and we see fewer and fewer in the Gulf, and we actually see a day when many of these platforms are going to be gone, you can project that out and you see it on a timeline, then you start to care more about what percentage of platforms we can actually turn into reefs. Okay, next slide, please. This is, I think, it's a perfect briefing, and I hope you all feel that way once you leave. It's a tremendous opportunity. I didn't mean to leave that quickly. It's a perfect opportunity. It's a win-win-win opportunity. What we're lacking is coordination. If we can better coordinate these activities, the oil industry can end up better, saving money. The fish can end up better habitat. The job situation will end up better. We won't destroy jobs, not meaning to. And I think in summary, we all can benefit. But right now, what's lacking is that coordination. So what we've suggested is improve the consultation and coordination among federal agencies, and I really have to underline here, state agencies. The state agencies are a really important part of all this, as well as the industry. We need to establish more reef planning areas, these areas that are designated to put reefs, and they need to be closer to shore. One of the problems is, anglers, right now you have an 85-foot limit. The top of the reef needs to be below 85 feet. And that means, just by the very nature of getting down to an 85-foot depth, you've got to be at a fairly deep level, fairly far offshore. And that, of course, limits anglers who can actually go enjoy those areas. And we think we need to, with all the troubles we've had in the Gulf of Mexico, we need to limit the use of explosives during decommissioning. We don't want to, if we can help it, cause any more unintended, unnecessary mortality on red snapper and other species than we have to. Let me say that if you came here today hoping or thinking there was going to be a lot of controversy, I don't think there will be. We're all in pretty much agreement, and I'll say that unless Jack suggests that we have catch shares for oil rigs, and if he does that, there may be disagreement. But I don't think he's going to say that. Let me have my next slide. So as you can see, here is actually, I got a chance to go enjoy one of these platforms before it was removed, and I can tell you it was a spectacular day. This was not last summer, but the summer before. I believe we caught, on that particular day, 19 different species of fish, and it was one of the most incredible days offshore I've ever had. So thank you.
So on that intro, we'll come to the infamous Jack Sterne, who's the Director of Strategic Initiatives for Oceans at EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund. But if you've been at all involved in oceans policy over the years, then most likely you've heard of Jack, who's been with a number of organizations beforehand and has a long history caring for and working for healthy oceans. So please, Jack.
Thanks, Walker. Before I start, I'm going to have a Marco Rubio moment here. So, Mike, I promised I was not going to say catch shares in this talk, but since you brought it up, I guess I'm going to say I'm not going to talk about catch shares today. I suppose I violated my own pledge. So, Environmental Defense Fund is one of the nation's largest environmental organizations. We have a membership of over 700,000, and we try to approach environmental problems, we think, differently than a lot of our colleagues. We really believe in finding market-based and incentive-based solutions to environmental challenges, and we believe in people being on the water fishing, so for people like Mike's members to have a profitable business as a result. One thing I should say is that I don't believe in PowerPoint. We believe in markets, but not PowerPoint. So you won't be seeing it. I'm just going to talk to you today. What's that? You take Nussman off. Yeah, could we not see Mike Nussman? No, I'm just kidding. Haven't we seen enough of Nussman already? So we want people on the water making money, whether they be guides or commercial fishermen. And we want people on the water spending money. I mean, people who are ultimately the customers of Mike's members. And I know Mike may dispute that, but it is true. Now, one thing that you didn't hear in Walker's intro is that I am a lifelong fisherman. And actually, we do have a few of those in the environmental community. They are not mutually exclusive. And at EDF, we are actually looking for ways to partner with the angling community to address challenges that are important to that community. So when the CEO of West Marine, who's a friend, asked us to take a position on this issue, we looked into it and realized that this was actually something that Mike says that could be a win for everybody. It could be a win for fishermen, it could be a win for oil companies, and it could be a win for the economy. And I think, not to mention, a win for the environment as well. So I'm proud to say that we were the first organization, national environmental organization, to come in and take a position on the idle iron policy. And that position has been to support a temporary moratorium on the removal of rigs in the Gulf until we actually come up with a plan to protect the fish habitat they've created. You know, Larry talked about the importance of planning, and I think this is an issue that we would agree with completely. You we have pushed, I think we've done more than take a position along with my friend George Cooper. We've really pushed CQ and the administration to get involved in this issue. And as Larry mentioned, Darren Brabbot, it's hard to say, who's the director of the National Ocean Council, has gotten in this and really forced the agencies to start talking to each other, which is something that had not happened before. And it is, I think, a good example of how the National Ocean Council can work and be effective. That said, I'm still not sure that there is going to be much of a resolution here, short of some sort of congressional action. And I think that's relevant to all of those of you in the room today. I'm surprised actually that neither Larry nor Mike showed the video that came out recently of one of these rigs being dynamited in the Gulf. I think if I'd realized that, I probably would have violated my PowerPoint pledge and shown you the video, because it is, it made the rounds quite a bit, and you can see the aftermath of the dynamiting of one of these rigs, and there are literally thousands of dead fish across the top of the water. Now, for those of you who followed fisheries, you know that there's been a huge controversy over rebuilding of red snapper in the Gulf. And so when fishermen in the Gulf see video, and some of them have seen this with their own eyes, when they see video of rigs being dynamited and thousands of dead fish on the surface of the water, at the same time that they're being asked to cut back their days of fishing consistently, you can imagine how that goes over. It seems to be a complete contradiction. You've got these you've got these two federal policies which seem to be completely going at opposite ends. And so for us, we've done a lot of work on the rebuilding of red snapper in the Gulf. And we'd like to see longer seasons for fishermen down there. What this does is these sort of inconsistent policies, they essentially create a lack of faith in the management system. And already there's enough lack of faith in the management system that we think that this is a problem that really needs to be solved. So we think this problem can be broken down into two issues. It's really fishing opportunity and safety. Provided that safety can be achieved, the policy should be to provide more fishing opportunity, which is also good not only for fishermen, but it's good for divers, and both of those things are in turn good for coastal economies. The benefits of more fishing opportunities are that because, as I said, because of the way that the snapper rebuilding plan has gone into place, fishing opportunity is at a premium right now in the Gulf. If we were to have a string of artificial reefs, as Larry mentioned, we could get answers to some of the questions about fish biology that currently are either inconclusive or worse, divisive. Larry, I think, is seeing an increase in the science that's showing that there is production. But the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement had a briefing a couple of weeks ago that Larry and I unfortunately missed. We were here at a thing of the Joint Ocean Commission Initiative, so we had competing priorities. But one of the things that was said there by the regional director for Bessie is that they don't think that the question is settled. They still think that there's a question as to whether these rigs just attract fish or whether they actually result in the production of fish. I think if we were to intentionally design a system of artificial rig reefs, we could answer some of those questions and put that issue to rest, because I do think that the weight of the evidence tends to be on Larry's side here. Again, this business, and even if, let's just say, if it's not production, if it's just attraction, as Mike points out, that equals economic opportunity. And so that's not something we should willingly and without intention throw away. we could set up a system of reefs that looked at, the question, you could design a set of experiments that could actually really test this question well. It might, I know as Mike would hate to hear me say, you might have to have a couple of the rigs that aren't fish so you can measure the difference. But that would be, again, a temporary thing that would be intended to answer a scientific question. But again, it's going to require planning, it's going to require intention, and it's probably going to require the encouragement of some of those of you in the room. So I mentioned that there's this issue of cost and liability. We haven't really gotten into that. But I think it's a big issue. As far as BSEE is concerned, they have requirements under their regulations and under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act for leasing these rigs that they view these as temporary installations, and they can't leave them in there. The oil companies don't want to be saddled with a liability that they would be required to leave the rigs in place in perpetuity. The states, there is a Rigs-to-Reef program, but as Mike pointed out, only 10% of the rigs have been included in that program. So as I was thinking about this in the cab ride on the way over here, and this is always dangerous to talk about ideas you came up with in the cab on the way to the talk, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway, is that we obviously have an enormous amount of money that's going to be flowing into the Gulf as a result of the Restore Act and potentially other oil spill related settlements. So if our big issues here on the part of the oil companies and the federal government are cost and liability, why can't we create a fund that would allow us to create this research program, that would allow us to create this system of artificial reefs, and that could be used to pay the maintenance, because the maintenance costs on these are significant. One of the things you don't hear is that you have to maintain this anode on the rigs in order to keep them from rusting and corroding and just collapsing. And it's apparently a very expensive proposition. So that's one of the things the oil companies don't want, and they also are worried about the continued liability exposure. So we could create that kind of fund to be able to fund the maintenance and address potential liability. It's essentially, you could create an insurance policy using the funds that otherwise are meant for Gulf restoration. And I think that you would have, if you did that, sort of a beautiful symmetry of using funds that were a result of the oil spill to continue to create fishing opportunity for a lot of the people who've been harmed as a result of the oil spill. So that's it. Questions?
Yeah, we'll have all speakers come back up to the front here, Jack, if there's two mics over there if you guys want to share, or you can stand over here and I'll just step to the side. Yeah, okay. I think Jack's presentation really summed it all up nicely, kind of pulling in the policy perspective, so hopefully you all got a nice roundabout view of all of the issues here. I think we'll take some questions now. We have some time left, so if anybody wants to start off. In the back? And if you could step up to the microphone, that would be great.
Hi, I'm Anna Marie with Senator Whitehouse's office. Thank you, guys. I have a couple of questions I'll try and ask succinctly, but forgive me if I don't. I guess you all mentioned there could be a win here. What's the win? What kind of congressional action are you looking for? It sounds like, potentially a change in the percentage of rigs that can be converted into reefs is a current limitation, but that the other processes that you're suggesting actually could happen at the regional level through regional planning entities like Gulf of Mexico Alliance or other entities perhaps being stood up. And so I just wonder, what's the balance there between the regional efforts and actually what we need to do at the federal level?
So, thanks, Edward. I think one of the issues here is that because of the pace of removals, there's a lot of heat around this issue right now. And it's become very emotional for a lot of fishermen in the Gulf. When we get in that situation, it makes resolution very difficult. Senator Vitter and Representative Palazzo in the House have introduced companion bills that would create this temporary moratorium on removals until we can come up with this plan. So I do think that that is one thing that Congress can do, is pass I guess it would be in effect an amendment to some of the requirements of OXLA to put this temporary moratorium in place so that we can create I mean, you're right, the plan would probably be done at a regional level, but it's very hard to do the planning when at the same time the emotions are so high around the issue of the rigs coming out. And the problem is that we may be losing some of the best habitat and not know it. And I think that's, one of the issues I wanted to hit on, is that right now the rigs are just being removed without any sort of consideration of what's the most valuable habitat, which ones provide the best fishing opportunity close to shore, and these are the kinds of things that I don't think, we could be losing, in the time it takes to get the plan together, we could lose a lot of valuable habitat and fishing opportunities.
I'll just make this comment on is that one of the things that we have seen as a result of even the idea of this moratorium is that the federal agencies, and I think Bessie has taken a leadership role in stepping up to work with the local groups, and they've held a couple of workshops there in the last month or so. They began to look at some issues to move their permitting process along at a greater pace that will really allow these things to happen. So that's been beneficial. From our part of the country, we have a saying that something like we call it all hat and no cattle. Right now, we've seen the hat part of it, and the point is, can we get some action moving on making these improvements that have been discussed by the agencies in order to address this issue very quickly? But that's one of the issues. We're seeing that as a result of, I think, pressure from Congress and so forth to get some action.
All I would add is we think this is a tremendous opportunity. We also think if the federal agencies do what federal agencies can do, which is take an incredibly long time to make some progress, we may lose that opportunity. So do we need a moratorium? Well, we need quick action. And if we're not going to get quick action, then we need something else that's going to slow the process down.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. What's happening here is that the federal agencies feel like their hands are tied. They feel like they have to move forward at this pace, and we are going to miss out as they continue to do that.
It's flattering that you think Congress is a place for quick action, I guess, right now.
Well, listen, nobody is against this except the oil companies, so.
Just one follow-up then. The pushback, I guess, that we hear is from agencies like Bessie then is these rigs are creating a risk. The idle rigs right now are a risk to other existing infrastructure. So if you create a moratorium and then Congress fails to act to lift it eventually, I mean, putting a moratorium in place is fairly drastic, considering that you then need to lift it. Congress needs to lift it. So,
well, no, and there is an issue. I want to bring it up on behalf that clearly this is the issue with oil and gas. I'm not from that side of it, but they have tremendous liability that they're facing if they don't deal with this. They don't want to leave these platforms any longer in the water than they have to, unless they're going to be converted to a reef. So the idea is we have to come up with a process that allows the decision to convert these things into artificial reefs in a time within that existing permitting framework. No one wants to, I mean, this is just a pure business decision, oil and gas. If they leave them out there and they still have that liability, it's a tremendous amount of liability. So we need to limit that where we can and work within that system. That's why we need to do some acceleration on the type of thing.
So one other thing you could do, I think what I said is, I think this ought to be a temporary moratorium. So you could put a time frame on it. You could make it 1 year, you could make it 2 years. You could address the liability issues within that moratorium. So it would be really a timeout. And it would be a planning timeout so that the plan can come forward out of the region without losing more habitat.
Next question, sir.
Hi, I'm from Congresswoman Linda Sanchez's office. I have 2 questions. Do you happen to know the bill number of the moratorium that's introduced? And then I wanted to know, do you have any estimates on the cost to properly convert one of these to a reef? And then you talked about maintenance, what the annual cost would be to maintain it?
Jack would like putting up a building for you, I'll give you that. Basically, in order, if you have a rig in the water, it's inactive, not producing, and it's just waiting to be removed. It costs about $250,000, I understand, but it costs about $250,000 a year to maintain navigation markers, anodes, and all that stuff. When you begin to remove these rigs from the water, it can take anywhere, it costs anywhere from $500,000 to $4 million, depending on depth and complications that are typically, you could say about $1 million a piece to remove a typical platform. That's the number that I think.
So the numbers for the previous congressional session, I actually don't know, have they been reintroduced yet? I don't think they have, but in the last session, the Senate bill was 1555 and the House bill was 3429.
Regarding the cost, and I'm certainly not an expert on oil industry cost, but as I understand it from a briefing I attended, the trade-off with the oil industry is largely if there's a place within about 35 miles that the platform can be deposited, can be reefed, it's economically feasible for them to do that. If it's more than, if you have to move that platform from its location more than 35 miles, it becomes a losing proposition. It costs more money to move it than it would to just take it to shore. So you're trying to create, with additional areas you can reef platforms, you're trying to make it more likely that the economics will work for the oil industry.
Just to comment on that, and that's one of the reasons, this is the plus side for oil and gas industry to do these artificial reefs. It costs them far less to take one of these reefs to a reefing site, as we were talking about nearby, than to take it ashore and scrap it. And so the progress works like this. They look at how much it would cost to take it to shore. If they get into a reef program, they take the difference in savings and give some negotiated part of that to one of these reefing programs in the States. They use that money to maintain these sites, to put buoys on them and all those types of things. So that's the win-win part of it. But I did want to make one comment on this issue, and this is something that I didn't have time to talk about. And this is those folks who say, well, we just need to get them all out of they're all just debris, and this is just ocean dumping, we need to remove them all. And there's two responses to that. One is just the economics. You heard a bit about that. There is a huge economic investment in these types of things that we're trying to preserve because of that issue. But the other is, if you're not interested in that at all, understand it. But the other is an ecological issue, because these artificial sites provide a place for these fishermen to go if those platforms are not there. So what you need to understand is that I think we've seen in Texas, according to the last set of numbers, an increase over the last 5 years, almost 400,000 fishermen, about half of those fishing offshore. That's still continuing to grow. These folks that fish offshore have powerful boats. They can make it anywhere in the Gulf, just about, with long ranges. They have electronics. They're going to find a place to fish. And if we don't provide them with these artificial sites, they're going to go to the natural reefs. We have 22 or 23 natural hard bank bottoms scattered up and down the lower part of Texas coast. In fact, we just found one new one. But the point is, those boats will be all over those natural areas. They're going to be out there fishing if we don't provide them another alternative to go to. And that's part of my emphasis here, is to provide those opportunities and places to fish, to keep the pressure off those natural reefs, which are important from a biodiversity and a reproductive standpoint. So it's a win for everyone in that regard.
Thanks, Larry. Well, time for one more question, if there's anybody else who has a question. Looks like you guys covered it all. Did a good job presenting. All right, well, that concludes our briefing today. Feel free to get some coffee and snacks on your way out, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next briefing.